Just a few brief minutes, but as a lead into what we're doing here this morning. And it's interesting as you and I experience the Bible in our lives. More often than not, when we experience the Bible, what we do is we read it. And when we read the Bible, it hits us at different levels. But reading a story is vastly different than either seeing a story or hearing a story. And that's kind of too bad in churches today, because in the earliest churches around the time of Jesus, people didn't read the stories. They heard the stories, or they saw them right in front of them. And so today we are going to have basically the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, presented in a form that you will see and you will hear, that I pray will hit you on a bit of a different level, because the 5th chapter of Mark is very powerful. First, a little bit of background. A number of weeks ago, I was actually on a Sunday in the afternoon. I was on a beach in southeast Florida, and it was a perfect day. It was hot, humid, sticky, a little breezy. Water was warm, exactly what you would want. And I was surrounded by tens of thousands of people on the beach. And there were white people, some people very, very white that shouldn't be out in the sun like me. There were black people, there were red people, there were people of every color you could imagine. There were people that spoke English, people that spoke Spanish, people that spoke languages I'd never even heard of. There were tall people and short people. There were wealthy people, you could tell from their designer swimsuits, to people with simple shorts. There were people of many world religions represented, as I could tell from the dress that they had or did not have on the beach. And what was interesting is, despite this wide diversity, nobody seemed to be paying attention to anybody else. Everybody was focused on simply their experience at the beach. Nobody really cared that anybody else was there. And it was then that it happened that I looked down the beach and I saw a figure walking down the beach, and as it became closer and closer and closer to me, I noticed that it was a man, a tall man, who had pants on and a shirt on and a jacket on. All were torn. He was completely disheveled. His hair was matted. He had a beard. He was singing to himself. He had a bag that clearly contained all of his worldly possessions. And it was then that this mass diversity of people that had not been paying attention to anybody all of a sudden paid attention to this one man. Heads raised, eyes gazed, and everybody looked at this homeless guy on the beach. It struck me that everybody paid attention to this guy because he was just too far out there not to notice. Too far out there not to pay attention to. And sadly, probably too far out there not to have some thoughts of revulsion. And that experience of seeing that man who was too far out there reminds me of 3 people in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, who were also in their day considered to be too far out there. First, there is the story of the man with demons that's at the beginning of chapter 5 in Mark. This guy, the Bible tells us, was possessed by thousands of demons. He was so distressed that he spent the evenings of his life in empty tombs. He was so distressed that people would run away from him. He was so distressed that Scripture tells us that he would take stones on the ground and cut himself because he was so filled with terror and rage and distress. He was so far out there, nobody would have anything to do with him. Kind of like the woman with the bleeding disorder in the chapter 5 of Mark. We hear in chapter 5, and we're about to see in just a moment, a woman who has a hemorrhaging disorder for 12 years. And in those days, if you were a woman and you had a bleeding disorder, nobody would have anything to do with you. You were considered to be just too far out there. And not only that, you wouldn't be welcome in community. You couldn't even go to the synagogue to worship. You weren't welcome. You were just too far out there. And then finally, there's the third character in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, Jairus and his 12-year-old daughter who is critically ill. Jairus is a leader of his synagogue, probably the board president of his synagogue, and he has a 12-year-old daughter who's very sick. And at first, while people gather around this little girl, when she becomes sick, so sick it becomes clear she's going to die, people flee. She's considered to be just too far out there. And what's interesting about this gospel story is that Jesus comes to those who are just too far out there and heals them. It's a dramatic story. But here's my final point and the thing I want you to think about. I have never in my life met a human being that is untouched by life. I have never met a human being that does not have a place of profound pain, shame, heartache, hurt, or distress, or regret, or sadness deep within. Now, the person may have it well compartmentalized and may have put it away and may have it under control and be very successful in life, but yet there is that place. I have yet to meet a person that that's not the case for. Again, on the surface, you may look all together, and in fact, you may be, but there still is that place. And what I think this gospel story, these three stories are about, is really an invitation to each and every one of us to look down deep within, finally, at those places that may feel like they are just too far out there to reach, too far out there to receive healing, too far out there to work through, and take that place, that space, that pain, that hurt, and do what the three people did in the Gospel of Mark chapter 5 and take it to Jesus and let him have it. And so as we hear and see this story today, watch it, listen to it, think about it, reflect upon it, and think about in your own life what places or spaces might be there that God is asking you to take that just feel too far out there, that God may be asking you to take to him finally. Paul, thank you